She did not choose this valley. She did not choose the man either. Martha Reed was 20 years old, and her father had decided both: the valley, the cabin, and the trapper who had been living in it before she arrived. He was capable. That was the word people used about Frank Ward. Capable and quiet, and no family that anyone knew of. The kind of man who showed up in a place and got quietly useful, and never explained where he had come from. Her father called the arrangement practical. Martha had other words for it. But out here, there was no one to appeal to, and the pass closed in November, and a young woman alone on the frontier was, in her father's calculation, a problem that needed solving before the snow fell. She was not the kind of person who fell apart over things she could not change. Her mother had died when she was 14, and she had kept moving. She would keep moving now. She just had not decided yet what she thought about the direction. They had come through the pass in April, when the snow was still heavy on the high slopes, but the valley floor had opened enough to move through. 3 wagons in the group. The Reeds, a young couple named Martell with a child not yet walking, and an older man, Oscar Farr, who had read law in Ohio once and had no family left and said little about why. The settlement had been there to meet them, small and plain and standing, 8 cabins, a 9th being finished, the river running fast with snowmelt along the eastern edge of the clearing. The people who had wintered there came out to look at the new arrivals, the way people look at anything that changes the count. Calculating, not unfriendly. Her father had the land staked and the cabin framed inside of 3 weeks. Martha chinked the walls alongside him, helped notch the door frame, learned by doing because there was no other way to learn out here. She did not mind the work. The work was the one thing since April that felt like it belonged to her. Gardens went in along the south-facing ground, potatoes, beans, turnips, the Whitaker woman's careful rows of cabbage, and the settlement moved through the warm months with the specific industry of people who knew what was coming and were not going to be caught short by it. She found her place slowly, borrowed a pot from Hannah Whitaker one morning, and returned it with bread inside. The Martell baby learned to walk and fell in Martha's doorway, and she picked him up before his mother reached him. And after that, she and Eliza Martell took their mending outside on warm evenings and talked about everything except the things that mattered, which was its own kind of comfort. Frank Ward she saw at a distance. He came to the communal work when it was needed and left when it was done. He moved through the settlement like a man who had made a quiet agreement with the edges of things. She noted him the way you note weather on the horizon, not yet close enough to know what it was going to do. Her father told her on a Tuesday evening in late August. They were eating supper. Outside, the light was going gold across the valley, and inside the cabin was warm and ordinary, and then he set down his fork, and it stopped being ordinary. He looked across the table at her. "Frank Ward has agreed to take you as his wife. I'd like it settled before the first snow." Martha kept her eyes on her plate. One breath. Then she set her own fork down. "You spoke to him before you spoke to me." He picked his fork back up. "I did." The fire settled in the stove, a long moment of the kind of quiet that has weight in it. "He's capable," her father said. "He knows this country. He'll keep you safe through whatever winter brings." She looked up at him. "You don't know he's a good man. You know he's a useful one." Walter Reed had the grace not to argue that point. He looked at the table instead. "I'm getting older," he said, "and this country does not wait for a man to admit it." Outside, one of the Whitaker children was being called in for the night. She went to the river after supper and stood there until the cold came off the water and the last light left the mountains. There was no one to appeal to out here. She could refuse and grow old in her father's cabin at the edge of someone else's life. She could leave, which meant the pass alone, which meant nothing good. Or she could move into a stranger's cabin and keep her eyes open and see what kind of man he actually was. She came back inside when she could no longer feel her hands. Her father was asleep in his chair. She stood and looked at him. The gray in his hair, the lines in his face, the way a man who had lost a great deal could still believe he was doing right by what remained. She did not forgive him that night, but she understood him, which was enough to get through to morning. In the morning she told her father she would go, not because she trusted Frank Ward, because winter was coming and she would rather walk into the unknown with her eyes open than be carried there pretending it was mercy. The following evening there was a communal fire. Martha came because not coming would have said something she was not ready to say. Frank Ward was there. Far side of the fire, eating alone. When the light shifted, she could see his face clearly, not harsh, not soft, just settled. The way a man looks who has made his peace with his own company. He looked up once and found her looking. She looked away first. He did not look again, and she was not sure yet whether that was a relief or something else entirely. She moved her things on a Friday morning. One trunk, a wool blanket her mother had made, a small tin box she kept for no good reason. Her father carried the trunk across the clearing and set it inside the door and stood with his hat in his hands and then left without either of them finding the words for it. The cabin was small and clean, a rifle on the wall, traps hung near the door, a table, one chair, an iron stove working steadily in the corner. A plank partition cut off the narrow sleeping room from the main cabin, the kind of order that belongs to a man who has only himself to maintain and has decided to maintain himself well. Frank Ward stood near the stove. Room's yours. Door closes and stays closed. She looked at the room. Narrow bed, window facing east. She looked back at him, at the single chair. Where do you sleep? He nodded toward the wall beside the stove where a bedroll was already laid out on the floor. Folded neat. Out of the way, taking up as little space as a man could manage. She started to say something. He looked at her then, direct, unhurried. I know this wasn't your choosing. He took his coat from the hook. The room's yours until that changes. He went outside and the door swung shut, and the cabin was quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. She had prepared herself for a husband who would be difficult in the ordinary ways men were difficult. She had not prepared herself for this, for a man who gave her the room and took the floor and made nothing of it whatsoever. It was, she thought, considerably harder to be angry at. He left before she was awake every morning. She came out to find the stove going, coffee made, the cabin empty. Not made for her, just made, and there was enough for two. She started keeping the cabin, not for him, for herself. She swept, organized the larder, mended a gap near the east window that let in a cold draft. He came back at dusk, ate what was there, said little. Not rude, contained. Hannah Whitaker stopped by on a Thursday with a jar of preserves and the bright, inquiring energy of a woman who had been wondering about this cabin for some time. She stayed longer than the preserves required. On her way out, she squeezed Martha's hand. How are you getting on with him? Martha looked at her evenly. Fine. Hannah smiled in a way that suggested she found that answer interesting, and went back across the clearing. The valley had accepted the arrangement without much comment. Winter made its own rules out here, and Hannah Whitaker had seen the bedroll on the main room floor with her own eyes and had apparently decided that was all she needed to know. One evening he came in and set something small on the table without ceremony, a wooden toggle for her bedroom latch that had been catching all week. He had noticed. He had fixed it. He said nothing about it and went to the stove. She picked it up and turned it over in her hand. "Thank you." He looked at her once, brief, even, and turned back to the stove. She fit the toggle to the latch and it turned clean. That night she left a plate covered on the stove for when he came in late. In the morning it was empty and washed and back in its place, and neither of them mentioned it. He told her the night before he was going into the high country, elk sign on the north slope. 3 days, maybe 4. Enough wood stacked to last a week. She nodded, and he went to his bedroll, and that was the whole of the conversation. Her father came by the second afternoon, and she put coffee on, and they sat together. He looked around the cabin. "You settling in all right?" She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Ask me in spring." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he knew better than to push. He talked about the smokehouse instead, and she was glad for his voice, even if she would not have said so. The third night the temperature dropped and she woke to wind off the mountains moving through the pines with a low and steady pressure. She lay in the dark and thought about the high country, whether he had found what he went for. She had not expected to think about him. She noted that and went back to sleep. He came back on the 4th day, late morning. She heard the mule before she saw him. He knocked once, at his own door, and when she opened it, he was standing on the step with his hands full, the back strap, the tenderloin, the liver wrapped in cloth. "Best pieces." He held them out. "Salt them today and they'll keep." She took them. Their hands did not touch. He went back to the mule, and she stood at the table and looked at what he had put in front of her. The best of what 4 days in the high country had produced, set aside before anything else. Then she built the fire up under the pot. The smell that came off it an hour later went out through the walls and into the cold afternoon. When Frank Ward came in, he stopped just inside the door, the way a person stops when something reaches them before they are ready for it. She put a bowl in front of him and sat across the table, and they ate together for the first time. And outside the valley was quiet and gold and going slowly toward dark. October came in cold and clear, the kind of weather that felt like a gift you knew would be taken back. Martha worked alongside the other women most mornings, salting and packing in Hannah Whitaker's cabin, the smell of wood smoke and brine sitting heavy in the air. Hannah glanced up one morning with the expression of a woman who has been holding something back long enough. "Ward isn't what I expected." She turned back to her work. "Most men that quiet are empty. He isn't." Martha kept her hands moving, said nothing. But she thought about the toggle on the latch, the wood stacked to last a week, the best pieces set aside before anything else. She pressed the thought down and kept working. He came back from a 2-day trap run, and she had soup on the stove without having decided to make it. He came through the door, and she put a bowl on the table, and he sat down and picked up his spoon. He looked at the bowl, then at her. "You didn't have to do that." She sat down across from him. "I made enough for 2. Don't read into it." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. She watched that almost expression for a moment before looking away. It was the first time she had seen anything close to a smile on him. It was, she thought, a significant piece of information. She found one of his shirts near the partition with a long tear along the shoulder seam. She brought it inside and mended it by the window without thinking about it much, the way you do a thing that simply presents itself as needing doing. She left it folded on the chair. He picked it up that evening and looked at it, and then looked at her at the stove. Martha. It was the first time he had used her name. She kept her eyes on the pot. It was just sitting there, she said. He came to the stove and stood beside her and looked at what was in the pot. Smells right, he said. She handed him the spoon. Tell me if it needs salt. He tasted it seriously, the way he did most things. It's good. He handed the spoon back. It doesn't need anything. Outside, the wind was coming down off the mountain, and the last of the light was going, and the cabin was warm. The first frost came on a Monday, and everyone knew what it meant. Martha worked until her hands were raw. On the third evening, Frank came in late and sat down heavily, and she put food in front of him without being asked. She sat across from him. My father's roof has a gap on the north side. I noticed it yesterday. He looked up. Then he pushed back from the table, took his coat off the hook, and went out into the dark. She stood at the window and watched the light from his lamp cross the clearing and stop at her father's cabin. 20 minutes, maybe more. Then it crossed back. He came inside and went to the stove to warm his hands. It's patched, he said. Enough to hold through winter. She looked at his back. At a man who had worked 14 hours and then gone back out in the cold for someone else's roof without being asked twice. She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to him settle on the other side of the partition and thought about what Hannah had said. Most men that quiet are empty. She was becoming increasingly certain that the opposite was true. November came, and the pass closed, and the valley turned inward. Her father came by on a Sunday and sat with them both at the table for the first time. He and Frank talked about the upper creek, the elk, the winter so far. Martha sat and listened and watched her father look at Frank the way a man looks at something he chose, and is quietly relieved, turned out to be what he thought it was. On his way out, her father stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. You look well, he said, like it surprised him slightly. She held the door. Go home before it gets dark. He smiled, the rare, full one, the one that looked like her mother had always said it looked, and went across the clearing. She stood in the doorway until his light came on. Frank was at the stove. He glanced at her once and looked back at the fire and said nothing, which was the right thing. By December, the cold was a different thing entirely, the kind that got into the walls and stayed there, that froze the water in the basin before morning. The settlement pulled itself tight. Nobody went further than they had to. She woke one night to find the fire nearly out. She came out to tend it, and he was already up, feeding wood into the stove in the dark, his breath showing in the cold air. Go back to bed, he said. I've got it. The fire caught, and she could see how tired he was, the particular tiredness that had been accumulating for weeks in a man who had not once stopped doing what needed doing. She went back to bed and lay awake and thought about what it cost a person to be that steady, without anyone noticing the cost. Word came through the settlement that the Pritchards had lost most of their winter stores to a leak in the cellar. Frank brought smoked meat from their own stores, more than was easy to spare, and said nothing about it to her. She found out from Eliza Martell, who stopped by with the baby on her hip. Frank brought the Pritchards enough to see them through February. Eliza looked at her steadily. Just left it on their step. Martha looked out the window at the snow. That sounds like him, she said. Eliza watched her say it, and smiled the small smile of a woman who is seeing something the other woman has not yet admitted to herself. Her father mentioned it on one of his Sunday visits, the way you mention weather. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "Came by yesterday morning, Frank did. Fixed the latch on my shutter." He looked at the fire. "Sat with me a while after." Martha kept her eyes on her mending. "I didn't know that." Her father nodded slowly. "Didn't figure you did." He turned his cup in his hands. A long moment passed. "You know he came to me before the month was out." He looked at the fire. "Said to give you time. That he wouldn't have you pushed into something you hadn't chosen." Martha kept very still. "You might have told me that," she said. Her father looked at his cup. "Figured he should." She said nothing more, but she sat with it long after her father had gone home and the fire had burned low. And she did not put it away the way she had put other things away. She let it stay where it had landed. One evening she came out for water, and he was sitting in the chair with his eyes closed, hands still in his lap, the way hands go when the body has run out of argument. The fire was low. She built it back up quietly, cut bread, left it on the table, and went back to her room. In the morning the plate was empty. On top of it, he had left 3 small river stones, smooth and dark, the kind you pick up without thinking when you are near water. She put them on the windowsill and did not take them down. The night the temperature dropped furthest, she lay in the dark and listened to the wind come off the mountain like something with a grievance. Through the partition, she could hear him on the other side, the particular stillness of a man trying not to move because every shift let cold air in. She thought about a man who had gone to her father before the month was out and asked him to wait, who had given her the room before she deserved the consideration, who had carried her father's wood and sat with him on the long afternoons, who had left the best pieces on the table and asked for nothing back. She got up and opened the partition door. He looked up at her from the floor. The cold in the room was immediate and serious. "The bed has room." She held his gaze. "You're no good to anyone half frozen." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his bedroll and came inside. He settled on top of the covers on his side, still in his coat. She got back under her blankets and faced the wall. The wind drove hard against the cabin. The stove ticked. In the particular silence that followed, she was aware, without looking, that he was already asleep, the immediate and complete sleep of a man whose body had been waiting a long time for permission to rest. She listened to the wind. She listened to him breathe. Outside, the valley was white and buried, and the mountains were walls, and nothing was getting in or out until spring. Inside the cabin, it was warm. That was enough. February came, and the cold softened, enough to breathe differently. She had stopped performing silence, and he had noticed. They talked while she cooked, small things, the traps, the Martell baby, whether the upper creek would be fishable before April. One morning she said, without turning from the stove, "Where did you come from, before here?" A pause, the pause of a man deciding how much is the right amount. "East," he said. "Long way east." She turned and looked at him. He met her eyes, and she understood that was the whole of what she was going to get, and found, to her surprise, that it was enough. Everyone out here had left something behind. The valley did not ask what. She turned back to the stove. "The coffee's better when you make it. I don't know what you do differently." He looked at his cup. "I don't measure. She laughed. The real kind before you decide whether to let it. It went into the cabin and settled there. And he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, warm and his, and meant for her. She turned back to the stove and let it sit with her a while. One evening, near the end of the month, she asked him directly, the way she had learned to ask him things, without preamble, without looking up from what she was doing. "Why did you agree to it? When my father came to you?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through honestly the way he did everything. "Your father was right to be afraid," he said. "I told him that didn't make it his choice to make." He picked up his coffee. "Couldn't say no to a pretty woman either, if I'm being honest." She looked up at him then. He was looking at his cup, the corner of his mouth doing the thing she had learned to watch for. She threw her mending cloth at him. He caught it without looking up and set it on the table, and the corner of his mouth went the rest of the way, and she turned back to the stove before he could see her face do what it was doing. The pass opened in April. Spring came in loud and sudden, snow melt in every creek, the smell of new ground coming up through the last of the frost, everyone out of their cabins with the energy of people who had been inside too long. The wedding happened on a Saturday, outdoors, the whole settlement present. She wore her best dress. He wore his cleanest shirt. Oscar Farr read the words, slowly and seriously, the way a man reads something that matters. And Martha was glad for the slowness, because it gave her time to look at the man beside her and understand what she was doing. She was not being pointed somewhere. She was choosing. She said yes without hesitation, not as surrender, as decision. He said yes like a man who had been sure for longer than he had let on. Her father stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands. He did not cry, just stood there with the expression of a man who had done a hard thing badly and was grateful it had not cost her what he meant to protect. She squeezed his arm on the walk back. He put his hand over hers and kept it there, and that said everything that needed saying. By the deep end of the following winter, when February had sealed the valley in white again, a child had come into the cabin and changed the count. She sat by the hearth with the baby against her chest, one hand spread across its back the way you hold something you are still getting used to being trusted with. The fire shifted and the light moved across the room, and the baby slept with the complete indifference to the world that only the very new can manage. Frank sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He was looking at the fire the way he looked at most things, steady, unhurried, present in the way she had learned to read as its own kind of language. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the edge of the clearing. Somewhere across the settlement a door opened and fell shut. The river ran cold under its ice and would run loud again come April, and the pass would open and the valley would change its count again, the way it always did. She looked down at the child, felt the small weight of it, the specific warmth. Frank's hand came to rest beside hers on the baby's back, not over it, beside it. The way a man moves when he is not asking for anything, just placing himself where he wants to be. She did not move away. The fire burned. The snow came down outside, quiet and steady, the way it always did. The valley went on.